Welcome everybody. Today we're going to have the 5th session of our Symbolon Seminar with Louis Kauffman. Today we're going to talk about geometry of shared consciousness in conversation. And this seminar series is part of our project, projet.y, and this is where you can find us. And this is the team members. Adèle Shaibi and Hye Young Kim, myself, and Eric Bouty. And Adèle and Eric, they are working at Intel. And this is Louis Kauffman, today's presenter, and this is me, because today's talk is a joint talk. And the title, again, Geometry of Shared Consciousness in Conversation.
And this is a summary of the talk as a whole. We're going to read you the summary to give you a bit of an overview, but everything that we say in this summary will be expanded and discussed in the next few minutes. This talk is a conversation about the geometrical and topological structure of conversation. We'll show how the very act of sharing consciousness and language leads to the structure of the complex numbers and the context of the complex plane, the conversants imaged at the distinct places of +1 and -1 on the unit circle. The I and -I, square roots of negative unity, take the role of the linguistic I associated with the conversant, I for +1 and -I for -1. The shift across the top of the unit circle for I corresponds to that place where +1 hands the speech over to -1, and the shift across the bottom of the unit circle for -I corresponds to that place where -1 hands the speech over to +1. We will discuss the role of Euler's formula and how an oscillatory view of the square root of negative unity is related to the Eulerian universal cover of the circle by the real line. This point of view leads to a wider language of categories for conversational domains. We shall see that an embedding of the complex plane into the projective plane yields insight into the nature of the roots of meaningful exchange. At the introduction of the projective plane, we find the concept of the observer and the relative nature of the unity of the real and the imaginary that gives rise to the distinction of conversation.
So this is the table of contents of our talk today. First, introduction, and second, from subjectivity to shared temporality, and the structure of conversation, shared consciousness from the assumption of unity, and Euler's formula and the continuous circle. And then we're going to talk about spiral and covering space and category theory, and lastly, projective geometry and the conclusion. So we'll begin with the introduction. So the discussion begins with attention. We take consciousness as given, but is it really given as we understand it? We want to investigate it through describing how conversation arises and structured, because we thought conversation could be a very good example representation that could show us how consciousness, and especially shared consciousness, if you could say that, could arise, and how this interaction between different entities arise and structured in terms of consciousness and temporality. So we contemplate a conversation between two individuals, let's say. But we'll start with an individual, because when we think of conversation, there are at least two conversants, and each conversant is considered to be a subject. And subject, what does that mean? A subject means that I am I, who knows that I am I. And when we talk about consciousness, it is always subjective consciousness, almost always, like especially in terms of modern European philosophical framework. So it is quite solitary, meaning that, you know, I have my mind, and of course there's another subject, but that other subject is conscious and has a mind, but I don't have a direct access to the other mind. That's what I mean by solitary, being this subject being solitary. And we decided to call this subject in English I. And there is I, and there's another I, like I just said. But this other I is not my I. And to this other I am also not the same I, but we're also the same I.
And this is reflected in language in as much as I say I and you say I. And I'm the one who says I if I'm saying it, and you're the one who says I if you're saying it. So there's no minus in the language. With it. This minus is an extra marker.
Yeah, it just means that it's not the same I. That it's not I. No, it's not I to me, but I am also not I to you, I.
Right.
So this comes with some problems because, like I already mentioned, we can't think of a way of having direct access to the other mind. I mean, of course, I believe that you are a conscious being as a subject, just as I am, but it's just my assumption. There's no way to really know that you're the same subject as I. I just believe it. So there are two different minds coming together to a conversation, and somehow, though, a conversation is possible. It's happening. The communication is possible, although I don't have a direct access to your mind, and I don't know how your consciousness is like, but still somehow we can communicate and understand each other. I mean, I hope.
And there is the level of our feelings. At the level of our feelings,
right.
There is no dispute about a belief of one person being conscious and maybe you're not, not at the level of our feelings. So that's somehow very important in the sharing.
Right. So it's not just understanding on the level of language and logical understanding, but we really understand each other in a conversation. That's how a conversation can continue. Next slide, please. But maybe it wasn't yet. But here we wonder then, how is this possible? If it's two different eyes coming together, two different subjects with different minds, completely separated, coming together, and somehow this conversation arises. How does this work? Is there any commonality, like common ground that is already pre-existing, or is it something that is created in the course of a conversation? So we start with these questions. And the next slide, please. Thank you. So here we have to talk a little bit about temporality because, next slide, please. Why temporality out of the blue? It is actually not out of the blue, because when we want to talk about consciousness, it's not just my subjective consciousness, so subjectivity, but also temporality or time is something crucial to our understanding of consciousness. Because when I say I am conscious of something, and that's not just I am conscious of an object, but I can do everything. I can talk and I can move, I can live, I do everything being conscious. And how does that happen? How does that work? It's through actually memory. And when I say memory, it's not a memory of like my childhood or our conference yesterday or anything like that. But this memory is really it's a memory that makes everything possible. so to say, I can lift a cup and drink my coffee out of this cup because I know how to do it, and I can listen to a piece of music, and I know that it's music because of memory, because of the previous notes and the coming notes, and I have a memory of all these things. And so in that sense, memory is a crucial thing. And so in this context, we do have to talk about time. And time appears in two forms. And the first, it's objective time. That means like clock time. What time is it? And how long do we have? How much time do we have? And so on. But also there is subjective temporality, meaning that it's my temporality, starting from the birth maybe, or from this moment up to death, or to a certain moment. And this is shaped by one's lived experience and memory and emotional relations. And consciousness is inherently temporal, and memory makes experience possible.
So the question of precedence of objective time over subjective time, or the other way around, is actually quite circular, because in order to have objective time, we need to have our subjective time.
Yeah.
And it's out of that. But on the other hand, we are situated in nature where all sorts of periodic processes have suggested to us culturally what objective time is going to be. The seasons, the sun,
exactly.
all of that.
Right, yeah. And here again, like in a conversation, next slide, please. So here we want to talk about the temporality in a situation of conversation, because here, so my personal subjective temporality is arising, like I am talking, I'm understanding, and I'm in this conversation, but I am in this conversation with the other, and the other comes with his or her own subjective temporality, meaning that he's in his own existence, being, and language, and but somehow it's overlapped and it's going together, it's arising together, and this is something like shared between us. And how is this happening, and how is this possible? So in that regard, we ask this question: how is shared temporality possible? And maybe through this situation or a particular structure of conversation, maybe we can view what it is like. So now we're gonna see the structure of conversation.
So, in thinking about the structure of conversation, we contemplate a conversation between two individuals who are called plus and minus. And the conversation arises from a commonality. It arises from a place where the distinction between plus and minus has disappeared or has not yet appeared. Relationship arises from commonality or from sharing. How does the shared time and space occur? We suggest that the answer to such questions is in the basic commonality of relationship. One can address questions of sharing from the point of view of separate individuals and how they are related. We begin in commonality and see how the weaving between individuals arises from the commonality. We begin with a state, PM, that is neither plus nor it is minus. Plus and minus have their roots in the PM, and the PM can be thought about in many different contexts. It might be the writer's blank sheet of paper before he or she begins to write something upon it, or it might be the theologian's notion of the Godhead that has no distinctions before distinctions emerge, or it might be the scientist's implicate order out of which physical orders of different kinds emerge. It might be the neutral monist's notion of a place from which all distinct things occur. So we just call it PM. And one can address questions of sharing from the point of view of separate individuals and how they're related, as I said. We have our ontological precondition. We begin with the premise that commonality is already there, has been there before any interaction of the individuals. And we indicate that by the PM, which you can take in whatever way is useful for you as a place from which some distinctions will arise. Here's the tableau for the conversation. Each of plus and minus have emerged, and they are each connected to the PM, a place of unity for them. We describe an external view of the conversational tableau. Each participant can either speak or hand over the speaking to the other participant. A word about the PM. PM is neither plus nor minus, but plus and minus arise from the PM. We can give a model or an example of this. You can think of PM as giving rise to an oscillation between plus and minus at first, before it became definite. And this is related to the mathematics of imaginary numbers, as we'll see. So instead of the PM, which is neither plus nor minus, we imagine the emergence of an oscillatory state that is also neither plus nor minus. It is going back and forth between plus and minus. And if you were to intone it in time, because we did introduce time in this small model, it would go plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus. And if you listen to that, you would find that it might have sounded like minus, plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, or it might have sounded like plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus. There are two ways of hearing it, and the two ways of hearing it are like discriminating the plus from the minus in the sense that the pulse goes from plus to minus, or the pulse goes from minus to plus. And in this way, we have a small picture of the emergence of some two definite things like a plus and a minus through time from the ambiguous place of the PM. So now we want to go over to the conversation. And this is a talking stick. The talking stick is a stick that the speaker holds and hands over to the next person who will speak. And this could occur in a meeting with 50 people, or it could, by imagination, occur just between two people who are handing the talking stick back and forth, one to the other. In English, the word I is our talking stick, and each person who speaks can say, I am the one who says I. So here's a diagram of the handover and the speaking and the conversation. Plus and minus are arrayed along the horizontal. Plus speaking comes to a place which we've labeled capital I, where she wishes to hand the conversation over to minus. And the handover could be imagined by the stick, so that I at the top could be thought of as the stick. And similarly, minus can hand the speaking over to plus at the minus capital I place. When plus, we can go on here. Note the appearance of the I and the minus I in the diagram. When I plus am speaking and the minus I becomes for me the not I, the other, and the situation reverses. So there comes the designation between I and minus I, even though when we speak, I am the one who says I, or she is the one who says I. So again, our diagram. And if you are familiar with this aspect of mathematics, you see that this is exactly analogous to the situation with complex numbers and the complex plane. In the complex plane, little I and little minus I are the square roots of negative unity. They square to become minus 1. And if we start at plus 1 and multiply by I, we get I, because I times 1 is I. And if we multiply I times I, we get minus 1. If we multiply minus 1 times I, we get minus I. And when we multiply minus I times I, we get back to 1. We have a fourfold operator here, and it's just like the handing over. So the square root of minus 1 models from mathematics exactly our fourfold situation in conversation. This picture of the complex numbers came into being around 1800 through the work of Gauss and Argon, and the basic interpretation is that I is a rotation by 90 degrees in the plane, and allowed Gauss and Argon to think of the I as being a point in the plane at unit distance from the origin and not on the real line at all, solving any paradoxical aspects of it. So here we have this double picture. On the one hand, conversation leads to a fourfold operator in a perfectly natural way, and it fits exactly into the complex numbers. So we want to explore this and the epistemology of it further.
Yeah.
Thus, we see that the basic fourfold circularity of exchange in conversation matches exactly with the fourfold nature of the square root of negative unity. And indeed, the I with the I squared equals negative 1 corresponds to the personal I's that occur for the participants of the conversation. I think we can demonstrate something else here as well, that the fourfold operator is really three-dimensional. This is a different interpretation of the square root of -1, but is relevant because it has to do with the relationship of two individuals. So if Angel would hold one end of this, I'm going to now model the square root of -1 by a 1/2 twist. And the reason why is because 4 1/2 twists are going to disappear, making it a fourfold operator. I did 1, 2, 3, 4. And now you should imagine that this connection with the twisted lines, twisted ropes, is hanging in space. She's anchoring it at her end, and I'm a floating ball in the middle of space. You have to eliminate my arm in order to do this, so that this belt can slip through my arm. And in order for it to slip through my arm, I'm going to do something which is not meant to be sleight of hand. I'm going to exchange my hands so that you see it's on this side of this hand, it's on the other side of this hand. So if I were to exchange my hands without doing any further rotation and come back, that would be the same as the belt going all the way around the sphere hanging in space. But notice what happened. It really is a fourfold operator. 4 half turns and it disappeared. And that means that between us, there is a fourfold operator operating topologically and in the relationship that we have geometrically between us.
Yeah.
So it is not just that in the descriptive level of conversation there are fourfold operators in the handover, but that actually in the very topology and geometry of how we are connected in three-dimensional space, there is a natural fourfold operator.
Yeah.
So in the mathematics, the I and the minus I are different, but easily confused. In our linguistics, the I and the minus I are easily confused. It depends on who's speaking. The extra distinction is usually not said. I may say, I think that the clocks are slow. You would say exactly the same thing. But if I had to sign an affidavit to that effect, I would put my name to it. And putting your name to it is just like putting the minus sign in. In fact, minus was the name of minus.
Yeah.
If you ask a mathematician about the square root of negative unity, she's likely to ask which one, and that's also the matter of this ambiguity. It's a choice of the symmetry, to break the symmetry, to say this one's the minus and that one's the plus. It's always the I am the one who says I. In describing the conversation, you label the two selves as I and minus I, and that allows us to line them up in the conversation. So at this point, you might fall into a puzzle. How can it be so that the name or pointer to a self, the I, should correspond to a negative root of unity, which seems a very mathematical thing? And yet our story shows how this comes about. So it's worth thinking that through. I times I is equal to minus in our situation, I rotates by 90 degrees. Rotation by 90 degrees is our picture of the half place where you could hand over to the other speaker. It fits together, and we want to explore it further. Before Gauss and Argon, mathematicians were very puzzled about I. That's why I'm mentioning it, because you see, if you started from conversation, you wouldn't be puzzled, but then you wouldn't be thinking along the same lines as the earlier mathematicians. So the key mathematical metaphors are emerging here. I marks the crossing point where self becomes other without disappearance, expressing essentially unity. And zero, which is also in our diagram, marks a vanishing point of difference where both sides dissolve into no difference at all. Angles in the complex plane capture relational stances between the participants, with Euler's formula, which we're about to introduce, translating between Cartesian and polar views and introducing the notion of angle between the complex numbers.
So up to this point, we focused on two different individuals taking turns to talk in a conversation. And now we want to talk a little bit more about the unity of the situation between the two or more conversants. So where do we go from here? You see there's a pyramid over the plane of articulation. One direction is to think about the unity of the conversation in relation to PM, an indicator of unity, and to see the larger geometry of the pyramid of PM and the plane of the articulation. The pyramid shows the unity of the conversation as a whole. Note that the pyramid can be seen as two tetrahedra, one with the vertices minus I, PM, as you see in this picture, and the other with vertices I, PM, and plus. The left tetrahedron can represent the left speaker minus, and the right tetrahedron can represent the left speaker plus. The speakers in this pyramid interact along their commonality PM and along the actions of passing the right to speak back and forth between I and minus I. As you see a pyramid over the plane of articulation, this way, thinking this way, we see that PM unfolds not just to plus and minus, but also to I and minus I. Indeed, we saw that PM does unfold in two ways when we considered oscillation. And in the next slide, we'll point out how to see that PM does unfold into I and minus I if we think about oscillation between plus and minus. So here we have to talk about iterants a little bit. We call plus minus and minus plus iterants. And
here we've come back to an image that we talked about a few minutes ago.
Right, yeah. An iterant is an indication of an ordered oscillation and can be taken as an ordered pair of values for this discussion. Iterants are amphibians between process and value, between verb and noun. Just so are we ourselves are amphibians between being and becoming.
It's worth remarking that Leibniz, who thought deeply about the square root of -1 before the geometric interpretations had emerged, said that the square root of -1 is an amphibian between being and non-being, between the presence and absence. And this is a kind of variation on that.
Yeah. Well, non-being, but here it's rather not being to me, like, or not I to me. So that's an interesting analogy, you could say.
Right.
Well, the oscillations can be regarded as ordered from plus to minus or from minus to plus. The iterants made time sensitive can be seen as the square roots of negative unity. Just so when we perceive ourselves, me and myself, there's a time shift between the seer and the seen. And what I see is in the past, yet I am present to myself. There is a paradox in shared and present time in this sense. And the iterans, seen as time-sensitive entities, are square roots of negative unity. And they are the precursors to selves. So here we can see that time has entered our discussion in more than one way. We have the cyclical time of the conversational interchange and its rotation of selves. We have the inherent oscillation of the unity PM that brings forth the distinct selves, and with it, the movement from one self to another self. And the shared time of I and minus I, and the shared time of plus, minus, and minus plus. Each self, each I, is given as an internal time. Plus, minus is plus as an oscillation that starts with plus, and minus plus is minus as an oscillation that starts with minus. And the conversation is an entrainment of the individual oscillation into a whole.
So you see how the plus minus can be thought of as modeling the subjective time of a given individual. Plus moves outward from himself to somewhere else and back to himself. And minus moves outward from herself and back to herself. So it's a very small model, but it captures the meanings.
Yeah. But before we go over to Euler's formula, I wanted to say a little bit more about this unity. So, like, from the standpoint of one's own subjectivity, others appear as conscious beings as well in communication, and this is through the boundary between their consciousness and one's own. But this boundary in conversation is fluid, and conversation probes this imagined boundary between me and you. And as I said before, direct knowledge of the other conversant, is limited because perceiving them externally diminishes access to their internal being or their mind. But when we think about some coordinated activities, something like music or games, pottery, or even writing, participants may move beyond this explicit sharing into a collective unconsciousness, meaning that we are in this synchronized movement or actions without even realizing that we're sharing this. But this is something collectively and unconsciously shared, and not only in these coordinated actions, but in conversations like this now. For example, a language is also a good example of this pre-existing unconsciously shared. Of course, consciously as well, because it's a language, but we don't think about we don't think about consciously how our language is shared. But I'm saying language as the base of this sharing at all. Like, in that sense, there are some other elements that we could see as collective consciousness, as like pre-condition commonality for any sharing.
Right. There's always this line of where is the consciousness's spotlight showing. So if I'm speaking, I'm also attending to some degree on the words that I'm producing, but I'm relying on the fact that my ability to speak English will carry me over to the end of a sentence. And I couldn't have predicted before I started the sentence exactly how it would end. All that is happening because of my skill or ability that came in before.
Exactly. And exactly something like that also comes like in a collective form between different entities. That's what I wanted to say about this unity. That unity is already there. Okay, not only just in an imaginary situation, but in everyday life, we actually experience it all the time. It's just that we don't know how to pin it down with the language and the frameworks that we have now. So we can move on and talk about Euler's formula and the continuous circle.
So here's the complex circle again, unit circle in the complex plane. Each point on the circle is a unit distance from the origin, and we've included now, along with plus, minus, I, and minus I, any point at all along the circle, labeled by e to the I theta, which is a symbol for cosine theta plus I sine theta, which in fact are the coordinates. This is the sine of theta, this height, and this distance from here over to the origin is the cosine of theta. And one finds when one explores complex numbers a little more than we have so far, that when you multiply two complex numbers, what you do is you add their angles, if they're on the unit circle. So e to the I theta multiplied by e to the I phi will be e to the I theta plus phi. And so every complex number rotates by an angle. And one rotates by no angle at all. I rotates by the angle 90 degrees. And anywhere in between occurs. So that's the beautiful result of Gauss and Argand, that the complex numbers are interpreted that way. And these strange numbers become just angle adders and multipliers of lengths. So we have this representation that any point on the circle, our circle of conversation, moving continuously between the conversants and back around. And so we could think of the two conversants as moving on the circle if we want them to, and they could be at a very close angle, perhaps agreeing, and then they could move away and be not so agreeing. All sorts of scenarios are now possible if you go to the continuity of complex numbers. This is just to remind you about the 90 degrees. If you were to rotate a coordinate point by 90 degrees, it's the same as taking its right triangle and rotating it by 90 degrees. And you see that what happened was that the A, which was horizontal, becomes vertical, and the B, which was vertical, becomes negative horizontal. So there's this flip. And that means the A becomes vertical and the B becomes negative horizontal. That version of the square root of minus 1 is the invention of Sir William Rowan Hamilton around 1840. People were not quite completely articulating this until the middle 1800s. So that's the 90-degree rotation in it, and it happens everywhere, anywhere in the complex plane if you multiply by I. Here's a slide for some discussion. Perhaps you'd like to begin a comment on this slide.
Right, so here on this slide, maybe I can say a little bit about the zero, the point zero in the center. We can see the zero as origin, and by origin, what do I mean? This origin has both a spatial reference and a metaphorical source. It could be regarded as a metaphorical source of their shared consciousness. So to say, we can understand this zero as this unconscious, collective unconsciousness that we just mentioned, something that is there as the origin, like the origin of our shared consciousness. And related to that, like we can also talk about I, because I is like a transition point between me and you, and from you and me. But at the same time, this is the point that represents the unity as well. So the unity and the separation both. And in that sense, I is comparable to the moment or the point of now in terms of time, because it's like the moment of flip between past and the future. So it is there, but it is not really real because it's just a flip, you can say. So in that sense, I think it shares a really nice, this comparable ontological status, saying that this I is an imaginary number, just like now. And this transition representing the unity and the separation happening at the same time, and back to zero, which represents the origin, and it's there as in the center of this whole happening, representing the origin of this whole thing, meaning the arising of unconscious sharing, or shared consciousness.
And we should know that the zero is involved. The zero is in the space of the conversation, in the complex plane. But we're imagining a larger dimension where we have the PM. And so the PM is projecting to the zero as we move. The PM is by its very nature independent of everything that goes on. But the zero is a mundane picture of the same notion of origin. And in fact, when you do mathematics, when you do language, you think of starting from a 0 point and then building from that point. And so it's worth examining the relationship between those two. Now we come to spiral and covering space. And the notion here is very simple, and it has a geometric correlate. The notion is that when you go around the circle of any interaction, you're not coming back to where you started, of course. You're coming back to maybe some new conclusion in the conversation. Or maybe you come back essentially to where you started sometimes, but the impetus in the conversation is that you are spiraling or evolving as you go. And we have that image of the spiral. The Euler formula actually embodies that, because the theta in the Euler formula is an indicator of an angle, and the angle can continue on. We can go from 0 to 2 pi, and along the circle we're back where we started, 0 to 2 pi. But on the real line where we go from 0 to 2 pi, we go 0 and up to 2 pi. And if we drew the real line as spiraling around the circle, where the points here are the thetas, so we might have started here at 0 and gone along until we got to 2 pi here, coming all the way around once, and then twice, and then 3 times, and so on. The spiral is then part and parcel of Euler's formula, and that spiral is part and parcel of the evolutionary nature of the conversation. And of course, you might have a partial spiraling where you went around and came right back. This is one going around and coming back. And even that is worth thinking about, because you could think of one level as being inside and then riding out until you're outside, and then riding down in again until you're inside. This exchange between inside and outside as with a set that is a member of itself. And you see this kind of recursion coming out in many, many places. And furthermore, it can be higher levels of the recursion if you spiral many times around and then came back to where you started. So this is part of the matter of spiraling. Interactions involving more than one circle can be very, very complicated. Here, we've indicated what would have happened if we had 2 conversations going and they sometimes would bow to each other. So now we have the A conversation happening and the B conversation is happening, but sometimes you go, A conversation goes through its spiraling 7 times, and then they shift over to B, and B is happening for a while, and then A is happening for a while, and you have all the different orderings and pathways. Could be A, and then B, and then A, and then B, and then A, and then B, and B, and so on. And you get uncountably many pathways in an infinite tree that fits into its own geometry.
We were saying this could also be a case of multiple conversions in one conversation as well, because that happens, and that's more complicated than just between two conversions.
Right. It also could be just you and me changing subjects.
Yeah, that too, which happens a lot.
More often than not.
Oh, I have another idea.
This is a cartoon. We won't ask you to read it. It's just a cartoon of two conversants who are at some angle, and you can think about that. Now we get to category theory, and this is for thinking about multiple conversations among a large group of individuals. Right. Let's see the slide. Maybe we'll skip this slide and just talk about the next slide. It'll be easier. So here's a circle of conversation. And here's a simplification of it where I just forget about the I and think, well, there's motions from plus to minus, and there are motions from minus to plus. And then I could schematize that by just having plus and minus, and an arrow from one to the other, and an arrow back. And that would be the most schematic, simple description of the conversation between two people. We couldn't make it simpler. If we removed one arrow, it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a professor lecturing to you. But if we have two arrows, there's the possibility there would be an exchange. And then there's also the arrow from an individual to itself. That's your talking to yourself, your self-reference, your personal time, all of those things. We could have an arrow for that. So if we're going to just have arrows, that's the beginning. And if we had three people, then we might have a diagram of how they were working. A and C are having a conversation. A also talks to B, and B transmits some talk to C. In that indirect way, B is talking to A and C, and A is talking to C through B. And you begin to get the texture of how it works when there's a multiple situation, and a multiple situation would have a more complicated arrow diagram like this. The most interesting thing about this, at least from our point of view at the moment, is that indirect communication, because we're all familiar with how that works. We may have someone out there who's very sensitive to our ideas, and we talk to that person, and that person talks to us. And we are in conversation with that person, but maybe not directly, maybe only indirectly. And so in the notion of category, there is a formalization of that, in that, given that there's an arrow from A to B, and that there's an arrow from B to C, there is also an arrow from A to C. It is given in a category that arrows exist, direct arrows exist, along with indirect arrows. That's this axiom for a category. The other axiom for a category is that there is a unit arrow at every object. That is, every object has an arrow that goes to itself, but in the category, as a mathematical abstraction, it doesn't do anything. If we were making conversation models, we might make self-arrows that do something. We can do that. We can make other categories. And then there's a final part that makes categories spatial. You see how composition, as we've described it, given an arrow from one to another and to another, there is a third arrow. There's quite a complexity of different kinds of compositions that can happen. And in particular, if you had four conversants, then the first three could form a composition arrow, or the second three could form a composition arrow. And if we compose the second composition arrow with the arrow from between the first two, we would have an arrow from the first to the last. But if we formed the composition of the first two, and then went from the from that person to the last, we would have another composition arrow, and category says they're the same. And when category says they're the same, that collapses category into something simpler than it might have been. But from the point of view of the inventors of category, it's very convenient because this kind of thing happens a lot in mathematics, but also in geometry. If you're describing spaces by thinking of making the edges of pieces of space, then this tells you that you're actually making a piece of three-dimensional space when you have 4 participants. And when you have 5 participants, you're making the edges of a piece of 4-dimensional space, and so on. So that when you have a category with many participants, you end up with essentially a very high-dimensional space. So category is a new exploration for us in the sense of what we've been doing, but it also moves back into the notion of space because categories themselves are abstract spaces.
Right, and this very naturally leads to our next explanation, which is projective space, and that's how we got into this point. But also I wanted to mention briefly in terms of category theory, we brought this in especially for the cases where there are multiple conversants, like we just mentioned. And what I wanted to mention again is that in this sense, we can see or we can explore this collective unconsciousness or collectively and unconsciously shared commonality. And this can be very well represented with this category, the
By
arrows.
focusing on one part in relation to everything else that's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Because even when we're just talking, there's another person and the other person's listening, and I can also, I have in my mind that other person, like, oh, how he would understand this, and all these different things going on in the background. And that is something that is shared between the participants of this situation, of this conversation. So we should move on to projective geometry, because it's...
So projective geometry is something that everyone is familiar with, but as a geometry, it didn't start getting invented until 16 and 1700s. When you make a perspective drawing, you depict a road with 2 edges, but in the perspective drawing, the edges meet at infinity. They meet at the horizon line. You have included the imaginary in the real in the sense of the reality or realism of your painting by having a horizon line. And this is real in the sense that it shows you what you tend to see when you use your eyes, because your eyes also participate in this kind of perspective. Let's have the next slide. So the perspective makes things appear smaller as they are farther away, and we've illustrated that here by an experiment that you can do. Here is this fellow in the foreground who has this height, and the giant looks much larger, but he's exactly the same size by measurement. But the main point is that the imaginary is included in the real. And we have been discussing how the imaginary is included in the real in the sense of our alternation of conversation. So perhaps there is some relationship. Let's go on. This is a schema of the projective nature of things. I have an easel. This is a one-dimensional picture for projective geometry. Here I have an easel that's being drawn upon, the vertical line. I have a horizontal world, and I want to map a point in the world, P, to a point on the easel, and I do that by taking it through a point of projection. And you can think of the point of projection as the eye of the artist who looks down to the point and marks a point on the easel correspondingly. Now, this artist also is able to look backwards to the to the part of the world that's behind him. He just turns around and he looks that way and gets a corresponding point from his right as well as from his left. And that, of course, is natural if you think of this as a point through which we're projecting, but we like to think of it as an eye of the artist as well. So notice what happens now. As this point P goes in the world out to negative infinity, the P prime rises up into the horizontal. And let's put the eye at unit distance from the line. Then it's going to I. That would be I. That would be plus I. So as P goes to negative infinity, this point rises up to plus I. Then what happens when you go to positive infinity? The Q prime, the other point, goes down and hits point at I. So that from the point of view of the projection, minus infinity and plus infinity become the same point in the projection. And that means that we could think in terms of the next slide, where if you have a line parallel to another line and you're projecting between them in this way, then when you perturb a line, a horizontal line that's parallel, you perturb it one way and you get a point near plus infinity, but if you perturb it slightly the other way, you get a point near minus infinity. Minus infinity and plus infinity are naturally identified when you're doing projective geometry. And we can, as I said, put the eye of the artist here. We can think of our imaginary line in the complex plane as the easel. We can think of a line between the conversants as the world, and then we can compare how the world of the conversions and the world of the I and the minus I are related to one another. And we see that from placing the I here, going to plus infinity or to minus infinity takes you to the square root of minus 1 at the top, takes you to I, to the I. And conversely, let's go back. Conversely, if we went the other way, then going to plus infinity or minus infinity here will take us to plus 1 with the I placed there. So there is this exchange between the ideal points at infinity, which are identified to one another, and both the conversants and the imaginary points. So all this is also fitting together very beautifully for thinking about the meanings of the conversation. So this slide is illustrating a little more about the geometry and the topology of the projected space. Recall for a moment that we said that if we took any linear direction, like the direction that contained plus and minus, and we continued out to minus infinity or plus infinity, then we ought to identify them. And this would be true also along the easel line or the imaginary line. That plus infinity should be identified with the minus infinity, and indeed any line at all going outward in the complex plane, if we think of it as the projective plane, would be identified from infinity to minus infinity. But different lines are still different, and each line has its very own infinity equal to its minus infinity. And we can make a model of that by just thinking of a finite part of the plane, a large disk area, and identifying one end at the boundary of the disk to its antipodal end at the boundary of the disk, like this on a disk, through the center from A to A. This will be identified, this will be identified, this will be identified. And so this looks a little complicated if you made all the identifications. In fact, if you made a bit of cloth and you decided to then sew it up to itself carefully, making antipodal identifications, you would find that the crossovers would prevent you from making all the identifications in 3 space. But part of it becomes an understandable topological object, and that's what we're illustrating here. If in the projective plane, where all antipodal identifications are made, we took a strip from this edge all the way over to this edge, these two edges are identified from A to B and from A to B, but they're identified in the opposite order, you see. And I take it out and examine it. I take it out, I examine it, I bring it together, but I find that even if I bent it together, the identifications are asking me to twist it because the top of the arrow is identified with the bottom of the arrow, and the bottom of the arrow is identified over here. So if I make a twist, then I can identify. So that's what a piece of the projected plane looks like. And you see it's a Mobius band. It is the well-known Mobius band, one twist on a strip like that, 1/2 twist. It has a single boundary you can walk along. And it also has one side identified with its opposite side. So that's the Mobius band, and you see that the Mobius band is sitting inside our projected plane. In fact, Mobius, in the 19th century, was a projective geometer, and he is also the inventor of the Mobius band. And it's likely that he came upon the idea of a Mobius band thinking about projective geometry. In any case, that's a good picture of how to think about, as a whole, the projective space. And so we wish to embed our conversational circle into the projective space. Not only will we identify the infinity that 1 goes to with the infinity that -1 goes to, and for I, but we will imagine our circle and the projected plane embedded into full projective space. So a disk out there, a large arena, and when you get out far enough in any given direction, you find yourself coming back from the opposite direction. And so this picture here is a good one to hold in one's mind, since it's a finite picture, but of course it has all these identifications in it. And then we can continue our discussion of the relationship of things, the relationship of the origin to the infinity, the fact that the origin represents no distinction, but infinity represents the imaginary, or it represents the conversationalists, depending on which way we are thinking. So the infinity is moving back up toward the PM.
So here, the origin, we can think of origin as something that is an imagined beginning or imaginary beginning of any relationship. And our being is placed in this infinity. Right. Anything else to add to this?
You could ask, where is your being? But of course, in one sense, you have your being in the particularities of being +1 or being -1, or being at the transition point, or being at infinity where +1 and -1 are coming together. So the being, or the I that we put in there that brought us into projective space, are unifying elements on our movement here.
So here we can also see that there's this already the potential of unity and separation in it, in this imaginary space.
Right. So, repeating it again, we embed the complex plane within the projected plane, and we see the richness of the conversation in terms of both finity, in the sense of these exchanges here, and infinity. Originally, plus and minus 1 are the same at 0, or the same at the PM. And we're seeing in the articulated world a multitude of ways in which they fit together. We can also think of the I as an ambiguity between +1 and -1, or an oscillation. And the +1 can be transformed into the minus one by going around the Mobius. That's another sense in which plus and minus exchange with one another. So that the world expanded by the Mobius, expanded by moving out into the projective plane world, becomes a world where certain distinctions are occurring locally, like the two sides of the Mobius band. But as we go out into the global, those distinctions can disappear and turn into one another.
Right. And I wanted to also mention briefly this Mobius band inside shows how we traveled from covering space and category theory into projective space. Like this shows the trajectory.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that was it.
If you travel around the edge of the Mobius band, you see that that's a familiar character from an earlier story, looked at a different way, because it was the character of going around one spiral loop and coming back to where you were. And of course, you can make a Mobius band that has some other properties by twisting it more. Now we're back to the eye of the projective space again. We're just we're circling around and looking at these images more than once. In this case, we're saying, look, here's the eye. It's the imagination in interpretation. It's the imagination of the other. And when we move to infinity by this eye, this corresponds to the place where plus one, if you move it out towards plus infinity, goes down toward the top of the eye. And minus one, if you were to move it towards negative infinity, would go up towards the bottom of the eye. And so plus one and minus one are somehow unified at the eye in the projective world. But of course, we've said before that they're unified in action in the sense that that's the place of transition between them. But these are actually two different ways in which plus one and minus one are unified. Two different ways which are seen to be unified themselves in this picture.
Right. So here you can also see that I and minus I, they're placed in this projective space, in this imaginary space, and that's where the transition happens, but also the unity is represented. So here again, when we think of this I, this is not an I, but I, like I am I. But this I is different from the I that we're familiar with or we're used to, because this I that we say always, like I am I, and you're not I in that sense. It is a result of a self-objectification, in a way that I have to see myself as an I to be able to come up with the notion of I and to be able to call myself as I. So to some extent, you can see this enclosed structure of I that is solitarily self-enclosed. But this I could free our I, ourself, from this enclosed structure. So we can say that this I is not I that is fixed and placed in an absolute space or spot, but this is something that is fluid and that is unfixed. So with this I, we can think of the exchange and the fluidity of I between different entities a lot more like easier or clearer.
And this I represents also the fact that we can stand back. The individuated eyes of plus one and minus one, each of them is capable of standing back and looking at the entire situation, which makes it a different eye, a surveying eye, and that's an I that is seeing and unifying all the relationships that we've talked about.
So it's like I am not placed at this point on this very spot and fixed, and I'm not moving. It's not like that, but in this space of imagination and space of conversation, we are placed on this I as something that is moving and movable and not fixed. And this is not just within myself and it's exclusive, but this is in the space shared in the conversation with the other conversant.
Right. So you might comment on
right.
Quote there.
So I just wanted to, I said it briefly already, but I wanted to mention that, so my being and language and my existence, I am existing, I am there on this extended horizon between minus infinity and plus infinity, which is infinity. And here, I and minus I, they're not two separate elements, but they're like a reflection representing this unity and transition between the two.
So that's a perspicuous way of talking about this I that we have imagined, which is a surveying I within the plane. And of course, we are surveying it with another I from outside the plane. And we're inside a conversation of the same kind that's being described in the plane. So this is highly informed with itself, this whole entire picture that we're drawing.
Yeah. So here we are, conclusion. So we want to talk a little bit more about the meanings of all this, this whole discussion. And I'm going to read what we prepared. So this exploration shows that conversation can be understood not only as an exchange of words, but as a structured geometry of consciousness, one that unites dualities, transitions, and shared perspectives. By mapping conversational roles and temporal flow onto the complex plane, we see that the alternation between speakers mirrors the rotations of imaginary numbers with I and minus I, representing both distinction and connection. And this modeling of shared consciousness mathematically has several significations. They look very interesting and it's fun to make these models, but it's not just for that. There's more to it. Phenomenologically, first of all, one could say that it provides a formal language for articulating the dynamic interplay between self and other, between separation and unity, without reducing one to another or one to the other. The mathematical structures, rotations, symmetries, projective mappings, they offer a way to visualize and reason about aspects of lived experience that are often implicit, fleeting, or difficult to describe. We need such models because shared consciousness, while very, very familiar in lived experience, often escapes our ability to pin down its logic or structure. Without a framework, our understanding remains bound to anecdote or metaphor. But with our framework, we can explore systematic relations, uncover hidden invariants, and connect different modes of experience under a common geometry. And this approach also helps us see beyond the modern invention of the solitary subjective consciousness that limits our understanding of self. It reorients us toward self as relation, a view that represents being, our being more fully, as inherently connected and co-constituted with others. In this way, the model opens an epistemological space beyond the enclosed first-person perspective, a space of relational imagination in which multiple beings understand through their mutual connectedness.
And I think that we might conclude with a geometrical demonstration about conversation in the following form. This conversationalist all by himself is attempting to do the impossible. I'll show you what impossible he's trying to do. He's trying to make a knot in this rope without letting go of the ends. He tries. You see, there seems to be some kind of knotting in there, but when he tries to simplify it, it goes away. But with the help of another conversationalist, we can hand the rope over, and then the rope, you should show it to the camera, and maybe pull it tight a little bit there. You see, there really is a knot in the rope. The knot in the rope occurred through our interaction, and without our interaction, it never would have appeared.
Yeah. Yes. So there is a relationship.
Thank you.
You can see. Well, thank you so much. It was very rich, I think.
Yeah.
And it was very fun for us also to talk about this, and hopefully we can publish this soon as well.
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
we can create text as well as movie.
Yeah.
Are we still recording?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So, well, thank you so much, everyone. You can follow us by subscribing to our channel, and you can find us on many other social media sources as well. Thank you, Lou, so much, and